This is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Postmodern Iconoclast, a podcast that helps you destroy and break the false icons and idols of the digital age in search of a more authentic esoteric spirituality. On this podcast, we discuss ideology, esoterica, and everything on the fringes of mysticism, religion, and related topics. Hello, this is your host, Georgina Rose, and welcome to the show. This is a solo episode. I know those are pretty popular, so I wanted to do another one for this big question that I actually think is one of the biggest questions I've been asking throughout this podcast. The name, the Postmodern Iconoclast, is not incidental. It's not to sound cool or aesthetic. I picked it because fundamentally post-modernity, which is the time that we are living in now, especially in the West, I will always have a bit of a Western perspective because that's where I live, is its own ideology. And it is, to an extent, filled with gods, idols, and ideas of its own, right? There are certain things that are cultural assumptions, and there are certain events that happen historically that are the mythos of post-modernity. And iconoclasm, the smashing of icons and false iconography, is sort of the goal of the show, right? To question postmodernity and to ask these big questions and always frame it from an esoteric perspective. So this episode is going to be about innovation. Innovation is one of the biggest questions in all of religiosity, esotericism, mysticism, magic, and all of those things. In some religions, innovation is a whole buzzword with special terms for it. So, what is innovation? Is it good for us? Is it necessary? And is it inevitable? So, to innovate is to add, right? To change, to mend, to bring more things on top of what is already there. Now, religious scholarship has been debating innovation for a very long time, and a lot of people fundamentally believe, especially thinkers like Rene Guénon, amongst others, that there are a lot of others who feel this way too, and a lot of modern religious movements and revivals are based around this premise. We'll be getting into that later. That truth is what is without innovation, because we live in an ever-changing world, right? It is 2023. What was happening in 1923 was an entirely different world. Genuinely, it's an insane amount of change that has happened. And fundamentally, even when I was born versus now, the world is unrecognizable. We live in a time of constant innovation, and the general cultural zeitgeist idea in the secular worldview is that endless change and progress is fundamentally good and is an inevitable part of the course of history, right? Everything marches forward. No matter what, it'll march forward and forward and forward, and there will always be somewhere even more forward to go. The thing is, there is no endless growth. Things don't go forever. And how does that affect us when we view things from a religious perspective, right? What does that mean? So, let's look into innovation. We're going to be discussing everything about it. So, let's get into it. So, I'd like to start with the very first religious ideology out there ever, to begin when there was no innovation, before there was even anything to innovate. So, humans have fundamentally been religious since their inception. I use religious and spiritual rather interchangeably, which I know not everyone agrees with, but I do that for a very specific reason. Because there is no religion without spirituality, and there's no spirituality without religion. I know everyone says, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious. Oh, I'm religious but that spiritual stuff is for hippies. And that's silly, because every religious expression has two sides for it. The esoteric, which is the internal, the mystical, the direct interaction with the divine, and the exoteric, the rules, the things you're told when you're sitting in the pew or listening to a khutbah, right? Like the things you are told, right? And these two come together to form religious expression, and everyone has some sort of view as to why they are doing things, even if that view as to why they are doing things is a view based in experimentation, right? And everyone who is religious presumably prays or goes to a mass or something like that and experiences spirituality in some way. Where that balance falls, I think, is more on the individual level, but fundamentally they go together. So prepare to hear me using a lot of terms interchangeably, because I think they do go together. But the very first beginning of everything was animism. Though you could argue that maybe even further back, our predecessors before humans might have had some level of religiosity. I know that there are certain animal species, I believe it is elephants, who have been known to sort of like circle under the moon. I know that there have been studies that dogs and cats are kind of more sensitive to metaphysical and paranormal sensations than humans. But we're going to start with humanity, okay? We're not going to go further back than that. Animism is the idea that everything has a spirit to it, everything has an essence. And this is a very intuitive belief, right? If you're like some primitive tribe person, right? You see like a big mountain and you find it intimidating. And so you're going to extrapolate some sort of spiritual significance to that. Now, humans with time developed more complicated ways of looking at these things, but this animistic understanding does tend to underlie most religions. Most religions have a concept of essence or divine sparks or God being amongst everything in there somewhere. So if you want to really eradicate innovation, we've got to start at animism. But most people who are eradicating innovation aren't finishing there. Most of them take the assumption of some sort of religion as their basis. So, the first religions were the polytheistic pagan religions. Abrahamicism and monotheism comes a little bit later. Most early religions were polytheistic. Some of them survived to modernity, and some of them fell sooner than others. This was essentially a period where there was worldwide polytheism of some extent, though it is important to note that not all polytheistic religions structure their polytheism in the same way. Now, modern paganism views it all as kind of like a big tent community, but historically that was not true. Different regions and different tribes and different nations would sort of compete about gods, and as their politics evolve and we began to create civilization, we began to do warfare, we began to build things, you would see gods moving around, and this is where we start really recording what people believed and what they did. Now, monotheism begins in one of two places, depending on where you want to cite it. That would be either Zoroastrianism or you could argue Judaism. Both of these are from some form of Middle Eastern paganism that was evolved into a monotheistic faith. Zoroastrianism would not become part of the Abrahamic religion. Zoroastrianism would remain its distinct character, and the real influence it would have on the monotheistic religions later on would be on Islam, specifically with Islamic views on the afterlife, with ideas such as the Sirat bridge, or after someone dies, the first thing they're encountered with is this big bridge that changes sides depending on your sins in the life that you must cross, being a Zoroastrian idea that was later incorporated into Islam. It is believed that everyone has to cross this bridge, and if your sins are too hard, you will fall off and you will then go to Jahannam, which is essentially hellfire. Now, Judaism evolves out of Canaanite paganism. There are certain spirits in that region that had similar names to the gods that they went with. Though it is critical to note in this conversation that early Judaism is not the same thing as what Judaism is practiced today. Modern Judaism is rabbinic Judaism, which is largely centered around the Talmud, which comes much, much later. So keep that in mind. Now, as monotheism grows, these religions grow into their own thing. Zoroastrianism is far more closed off and still is. Judaism is in many ways a insular religion as well, but you can convert into Judaism. It is very, very difficult to convert into Zoroastrianism, though right now there is a growing of Zoroastrian observance, specifically in Iran, where Islam is falling out of favor in favor of secularism and Zoroastrianism. The secularism there is the fastest growing atheistic movement in the world, but for those who still believe in spirituality but are questioning the Shia Islam that dominates that country, a lot of them are going Zoroastrian. There are other monotheistic religions that come into play outside of the Abrahamic paradigm, specifically Yazidism. I really want to get a Yazidi on the show, actually. Yazidism is another monotheistic religion, though you could argue it is a duotheism, where essentially there is the main god, and then there is a peacock angel named Melik Tau. A lot of people have correlated Melik Tau with Jibril, which is Gabriel, obviously. Jibril is heavily infused into Islam and is where Muhammad gets a lot of his messages from. But Gabriel is, of course, a character in the Christian Abrahamic paradigm. But I do put Yazidism rather separate, as Yazidism does not return to the Torah or the New Testament, right? Whereas Islam does kind of turn to them, though Islam changes so much of that Abrahamic lore that I tend to put it in a separate category. And obviously, Christianity believes is a fulfillment and a supersession of Judaism. So, putting all that out there, all these faiths emerge, and with time, all these faiths evolve and innovate, right? Judaism, as it was back then, is not Judaism now, right? The addition of rabbinic authorities, of Kabbalah. I know everyone in mysticism finds Kabbalah really fascinating. It's kind of what brings certain people to convert to Judaism. Kabbalah did not exist at this point in time. The first Kabbalistic text were the Bahir and the Sefer Yetzirah, which once again are a little bit later, and a large amount of what Kabbalah is comes from Isaac Luria, who is way, way, way far down the line. Like, if you've seen the Tree of Life drawn in the most common Jewish style, that is Luria's Tree of Life. And so, once again, like, that is in and of itself an innovation, right? Whereas some folk traditions within Judaism, you could argue, are not as much of an innovation as they go further back. But what's interesting about things that are not innovations within the monotheistic Abrahamic paradigms, that often they do have pagan and polytheistic roots. I tend to dislike the idea that the Abrahamic religions just stole things from paganism, because I think that's an oversimplification. But the truth is, to some extent, that is true. I think borrowing or syncretizing is probably the best word for it. Because when something comes through and knocks out what came before it in their moment of iconoclasm, they tend to incorporate some things, because when you're trying to convert a mass group of people, most likely you're going to want to keep some of those things, or they're simply not going to get on board. And thus, you see these interesting syncretisms. Now, let's get to Christianity. We all know modern Christianity is not what Christianity was during the early church, right? Things were not codified. There were a lot of heretical sects. A lot of people argue that certain things have been mistranslated or misprinted, or Bible books have been taken out or put in, which is true. The Bible was assembled later, and different churches literally use different Bibles. I didn't realize this growing up. I was exposed to Episcopalianism and Mormonism, which are obviously very different. But before I was exposed to Mormonism, I was exposed to Episcopalianism, because my dad remarried a Mormon woman. That's that lore there. Now, Episcopalianism, I thought, was the only Bible. I thought all Christianities were more or less the same. And then I was exposed to Mormonism, which is a complete innovation. And Mormonism adds the Book of Mormon. I remember very distinctly sitting in youth group at the Mormon church. It was the first time I'd ever been there. And they had this like VCR playing, right? You know, you remember those videotapes, the square ones? Anyways, they put it on TV, and it's talking about Utah and Joseph Smith. And I was so confused. I didn't know what was going on. I was beyond perplexed. And they played it, and then they told us about Utah, and I was so confused. I didn't even know what to say. And so for me, that was the first time that I had encountered innovation that I didn't understand. But the truth is, the Episcopalianism that I did understand, that was an innovation. It was an innovation off of Catholicism, right? Because one of the kings of England wanted to divorce. And after that point, the Church of England became the Episcopal or the Anglican Church. For those who are in Europe, the Episcopal Church is kind of like the Anglican Church. It's a break-off. There is technically an Anglican Church in America, but it's not as common. There's a lot less of them. So most people who are Anglicans in the U.S. are technically Episcopals. And that tends to be what they identify as. That's what my family is, right? Most of my family are Episcopals. Though I also have Mormons in my family. And Mormonism, whole different beast. I don't think Mormonism exists much outside of the U.S. I know certain countries it has some level of a hold in. There's some country, I believe, in Asia that has a fair amount of Mormons. But to most people outside of the U.S., Mormonism is kind of a foreign, strange religion. And I'll get into some of that at some point, too. I'd love to talk about my experience and thoughts on Mormonism. But fundamentally, every religion is an innovation. And when people first encounter innovation outside of what they believe, it shocks them and it confuses them and they don't understand it, right? They're like, what is this? Why would you do that? Why would you change the scripture? Why would you change these sacred texts? without all of us often realizing that our beliefs stem from a change, right? If you are to truly reject innovation entirely and search back, you're going to be searching so far back that you might be losing your mind. Now, when we think about the churches that have been more stagnant within Christianity, we're talking about the Orthodox and the Catholic Church. Both of these churches claim to be the original Church of Jesus, okay? You guys can get in a flame war in the comments if you want to argue about that one, but they are innovations. They are not what it was happening at the very beginning, though they are definitely closer than, say, the Mormons or the Episcopals, and I think they make a bit more sense. There is also a even older church, which is the Coptic Orthodox Church and the other Oriental Orthodox churches, and the big difference with them, and this is something that I would have never even considered when I was around Christianity, is they actually reject, like, the Trinity idea. And this was the first ever schism within Christianity. And that's where you get all the other Orthodox churches. Now, the Orthodox churches and the Catholic churches split as well. That was the Great Schism. Big deal. A lot of drama happened with that. And so now both of them claim to be the true church, right? But they both consider their other, like, sacraments to be valid, which is interesting to me because their rites are kind of similar. But they're different enough that they still are schismed. Every once in a while, people say they're going to reunite. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But even then, that schism was an evolution. And within those churches, since then, there have been innovations as well. In Russia, the Russian Orthodox Church had a big split with this group of people known as the Russian Old Believers, who are a really interesting religious group to me because they actually have a bit of a pagan influence to them, in a way that other Orthodox churches really don't. In the Slavic world, the big pagan movement is Rodovny. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. Rodovny. It's Rodven, something like that. I don't speak any Slavic languages, my apologies, but shout out to that movement. And they have kind of set themselves up in the Slavic world as a sort of return to the pagan traditions. And what's so interesting about the Old Believers is they are so committed to being Orthodox that they reject the modern Orthodox Church and kind of reincorporate pagan things in them. They would deny being pagan at all. They would reject that. They would get mad at me for saying this. But there is some weirdness going on there. They have a community in the U.S. in Oregon, which is really cool. At some point I want to hop over there and try to go to one of their church services and find out the truth myself. Maybe that'll be a trip I do at some point. But schisms within there. And now, if we look at the Catholic Church, they had a big event called Vatican II. A lot of people on Twitter get really mad about this, where essentially the Catholic Church decided to modernize and align themselves more with the changing times. This happened in the 60s, and they got rid of the Latin Mass and changed it for the Novus Ordo Mass, which is kind of in the language that you go to. Though it is important to note that Latin Mass, that people call the eradication of it, like the falling of the church, and there's this whole splinter group of people who don't think the Pope is the real Pope, and they think he's the Antichrist. Craziness. If you want to go to crazy Google time, there's this group called the Palmarian Church. Craziest website I've read in my life. They think that the Pope is evil, and they think that they are the true Pope. They built their own cathedral, and they also think Mary is in the communion wafer. So if you want to go a little crazy, look up that website. It's just scroll. I think they're also on Twitter. Really wild stuff. But that was not the first thing they ever did either. Things changed. Every religion innovates. You see, this is the problem with trying to eliminate innovation. Literally everything is an innovation, and you're going to go crazy. But we are going to try. For the truth. For the gnosis. Because this is one of the leading things people do to try to get gnosis, is they try to turn back the clock as much as possible. So we are turning back the clock. So let's move on past Christianity, which has had their innovations a million times. And we're going to go to Mormonism. Why do I say Mormonism is not Christianity? People will get mad about that, especially because I grew up around Mormons. The reason why I think Mormonism is not Christianity is because I grew up around Mormons. And I know what Mormonism is. Mormonism is a lineage from the Masonic, Templar, Western Esotericism Lodge lineage. There's a lot of conspiracy theories about this, so I'm just going to say the facts. Joseph Smith was involved in Freemasonry and possibly other lodge occultism, and he died with a Solomonic pentacle in his pocket. And if you go to the temple rituals at the Mormon church, they do specific gestures that have roots in lodge occultism. Specifically, the penal sign that they do where you slash the neck. If you've been to any if you've ever even been to a Gnostic mass, like a public Gnostic mass at an OTO, you know that sign. It's that little slit throat sign, right? You know that's occulty. And so Mormonism, I think, has an interesting lineage, as that lineage is not really like a mainstream Christian lineage. You could cite it back to the Gnostic cults, and I think that's interesting because within Mormon theology, there are extreme deviations in a lot of places. The Mormons believe in multiple heavens. They have a different view on the divine feminine. Really, Mormonism is so fascinating once you get past that kind of surface level of it. There were also a lot of folk occult traditions going on during early Mormonism. If you guys are interested in this, there's a really good book called, I believe it's called Magic in the Early Mormon Worldview, something like that. If you type that in, you'll find it. It's a really good book. But there was a lot of weird esotericism happening at the beginning of Mormonism. That book is by someone who was in the Mormon church. It's not like conspiracy strangeness. Not that some of that may not have some truth to it, who knows. But Mormonism is such an innovation that I don't even know if you can call it part of the lineage, right? Lineage is a term I feel like I should define right now, because every religion and every sect and every group has a lineage, or the thing that came before it. If you've spent time in like occultist spaces, you'll hear the word lineage every 15 seconds, because any esoteric order you show up to is going to have a lineage, right? Who initiated me? Who initiated that person? Who initiated the person before that? But lineage is not always that literal. I think when we're talking about lodges or priesthood or priestesshood, lineage should be seen as that literal, right? Who initiated who initiated who, right? And who does that initiation go back to, right? For those things, yes, it should be viewed like that. But when it comes to whole religions, I think we need to remember that lineage can be broader, because the world's religions, in my view, can be divided into currents, right? Metaphysical underpinnings that they align for. I really like the word current, because I think some different religions are hacking into the same thing, whether they're aware of it or not. And I think when we think of these big religions, the best thing to look at is what is their current? What is their actual, like, esoteric predecessor? And for the Mormons, we gotta give it to that Templar Lodge occultism line, right? That is what that is from. Now, let's turn eastwards. We're going to the Near East or the Middle East or whatever it is you want to call it. I've been a fan of the term Near East. I know people think it's kind of an antiquated term, but I actually quite like it, because when people say Eastern esotericism, they think of like Hinduism, Shintoism, Buddhism. I think for Islamicate and Arabian practice, I like the word Near Eastern esotericism. So I'm going to use that. You can sound off if you don't like that term. But in the Near East, you've got Islam and Arabian paganism, or Arabian polytheism. There were also, before Islam's rise, a number of weird heretical religions going on. A specifically interesting one to me are the Himyarites. They were a Jewish of sorts kingdom. Emphasis on of sorts. They were in modern day Yemen, and they had a very syncretic view of Judaism that I think would shock anyone who's involved with rabbinic and Talmudic interpretations of Judaism now, where they had a nation god, a national goddess named Shams, who Shams appears actually a number of places in the Arabian Peninsula, and she was actually viewed very differently across the peninsula, specifically the Bedouin people, which are kind of a nomadic tribal people that actually still exist. They're all over the Middle East. You see them in Jordan, Arabia. They're kind of all over the place. And they actually feared Shams. They thought she was this very fearsome, a hot, scorching, severe goddess. And then you go further south to Yemen, where they're not as nomadic, or the Himyarites were not nomads. And they venerated Shams very heavily. But they also venerated the Jewish god, though they called him by a very different name, which calls into question if they're venerating the same god at all, in my view. They called him Rahman. You know anything about Arabic, you're going to find that name a little bit interesting, because Rahman is used as one of the names of Allah. It also is used in the expression Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, the invocation of Allah at the beginning of every single Quran verse or Sufi prayer or in anything. The beginning of Salat, it's that. It's everywhere. That little expression is all over the place. And so that name is really interesting because I would say this is the closest thing you can get to pinning Islam to anything before it. I still contest that there are different religions, but I might even contest that the Himyarites are kind of doing their own thing. But that is a little thing that threw me for a bit of a loop. So you got those people, and you've got these very heretical sects of Christians who are kind of doing their own thing. Anyways, you got a lot of pagans as well, a lot of polytheists. The polytheists were all tribal. They all kind of had overlapping goddesses, but it varied a little bit depending on exactly where you were. And then a big innovation happened. Muhammad has a series of visions that he believes were sent to him by an angel named Gabriel, for those in the West. And he believes he is the last messenger of Allah. I am going to use the term Allah and not God for a very specific reason. I contend that Islam is different than the other Abrahamic religions. Allah is also the name of a regional god in that area. And I think law would be a more faithful translation of the word God, because if you read the Islamic oath, or the Shahada, it's called the Shahada in Arabic. It's that big thing you say. If you say the sentence, you become Muslim, right? La is used for God, and it says La ilaha illallah. That bit, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It uses La for God and Allah. There is no God but Allah, right? So I'm going to contest that Allah is a name, a specific name, just based on that linguistic technicality. If it was not just a name, I think that would be phrased differently. So keep that in mind. So we got that. And this becomes a big revolution in that area. It becomes a whole thing. There's a bunch of conquering and invading and going everywhere, right? They conquer a ton of land. They convert a ton of people. It gets really big. There's this whole caliphate thing. And then there's this big schism within the caliphate that becomes the big break in Islam between the Sunnis and the Shias. This is all about kind of a political distinction that becomes a more spiritual distinction about this, who is the successor to Muhammad and who should be in charge. And then after this, a huge schism happens that was never rectified. Some people get martyred, some people go to war, lots of killing and violence. Really a great time. Anyways, you get two sects, and then you start getting even more sects over other distinctions, like should saints be venerated? Can you do acts like hitting yourself? Whatever, right? A lot of infighting goes on here. And then what happens centuries and centuries and centuries later is people try to sort out what is like Islam without innovation, because there's a lot of innovating during all this time, right? Certain movements come up, like there's a bunch of them. There's so many. I don't even think I have time to go through it. Like there's some Sufis who kind of pray to Muhammad, the Barelvis. There's saints. There's people bringing in other outside influences into the thing, like a lot of Shias in Iran honor Nowruz, which is the Persian New Year. That's kind of a Zoroastrian thing, but then people say that it's not Zoroastrian. Whatever, right? A lot of stuff happens. And what happens is these people try to eradicate innovation within Islam, right? And this creates kind of a shit show, honestly, because this makes people start claiming that other people aren't real Muslims, and that causes a lot of violence, and it was bad. Not a good time. But the reason why I bring all this up is a lot of people argue that Islam is the most sans innovation religion out there. This was Rene Guénon's thesis. You guys know I really like Guénon. I think he makes a lot of good points, especially about modernity. But kind of where he loses me is some of his takes on Islam, because yes, Islam has stood against modernity. It has not innovated into postmodernity, which certain Christian sects have, especially Lutherans and Episcopals. But there's been a lot of innovation there, and kind of the funny thing about this is the rise of Islam was the original innovation, right? because a lot of the ideas in Islam existed before Islam, right? The Kaaba, Allah as a god. I mean, what the pagans seemingly believed, based on a lot of different sources, that Allah was the supreme god, and the other gods can kind of intercede underneath it, which the biggest sin in Islam is shirk, which is associations, and partners, which that word partner is really strange to me, because if there were all these goddesses and gods that could intervene underneath, how is that a partnership? It's not seeing someone as equal. And so is this entire thing kind of an innovation? And that's where you get to heresy zone. That's where you get to fun zone. Good time, good time, good time. Just food for thought there. Now, let's move to my next point after I just called everything innovating. Good time. Now, the next question we need to talk about is innovation good? So I've been talking about what it is and all the innovations that have happened, but why is innovation bad? Why should we avoid it? Why does it matter? Well, that really comes to one question. Well, two. One, does the truth evolve? Now, I'm inclined to say fuck no to that question. Truth is truth, right? Virtue is virtue, right? If you say everything can change, then nothing means anything, right? It's like the idea of your head is so open-minded, it just might fall off, right? But maybe things do evolve somewhat. This is a question where you really need to, have some boundaries with it, because if you let, the idea that the truth doesn't exist permeate you, you're gonna lose yourself and you're gonna get incredibly lost. And this was actually one of my gripes. We're gonna spill some tea. We're gonna give some hot takes with Thelema. I remember I platformed this guy who had a whole conversation with him about consensus Thelema that I actually think is kind of somewhat relevant to this conversation. I disagree with some of the things that were said in that conversation, by the way. And then Thelema, there was this big debate about consensus, right? If Thelema is do what thou wilt, it should be the whole of the law, and you can do anything and still be a Thelemite, does Thelema mean anything? And that idea is not just something within Thelema, and in fact, I don't think that's a Thelema thing at all. I think that's a broad thing on modern religion. I think that we have become so open-minded that our head has simply fallen off, and we forget that there is truth there. But can we take that idea and still admit that perhaps there might be some amount of change? But if some change is real, what makes a change real and what makes a change bullshit and something we should throw apart? And that would be, what does it mean and what is the metaphysical dimension to it? So, the best case that I think you can make for innovation being good is metaphysical ages. So, in modern life, we see time as a linear line, either one going up or one going down. Whether you believe that we are endlessly on a utopian course towards progression, or you believe we're in an endless state of decline and crashing and burning and degeneration, those are linear views, and I don't think either of those make sense at all. Right? I think this assumption that everything will keep going the way it is going, whether you believe that's good or bad, is silly, because if you look at history, that's just not true. I mean, even constant growth in terms of technologies did not always grow this fast, and there have been times when technology has declined. In fact, I would argue that current technological development is a little bit slower than it was 50 years ago, and we were inventing things going to the moon within, half a century of us learning how to fly a plane, right? Things are slower than they were, and fundamentally, there isn't endless things, right? There's a finite amount of people, there's a finite amount of resources, right? Things are not endless, and they can't decline endlessly because it has to hit a rock bottom somewhere, and people will eventually change their minds or do something different, right? Humans are anything if not impatient. So if we throw those views out, we get to questioning, what is time? What is growth? Where are things leading us? And where are things taking away from us? And we get to some sort of aeonic view, right? I believe in an aeonic view. I believe time can be divided into ages, and those ages are cyclical. I believe in life, death, and rebirth. Those three things are what happen again and again and again. Everything is moving in a circle. So if everything is moving in a circle, that means the metaphysical quality of what we are experiencing is in flux and changing. Thus, things are going to innovate based on the conditions of what is exactly happening. But I am talking about metaphysical conditions, not material conditions. I do not believe in some weird materialistic view of history. And this is why, like, there are other views of history. I think a big one that comes up is dialectical materialism, which is a Marxist view of history. That is a fundamentally secular view that I believe is fully incompatible with religion, because that entire view hinges on materialism being the only ideology that can exist, and a rejection of spiritualism, which fundamentally what I believe in is spiritualism kind of to the extreme. I believe everything is metaphysical. I think, and someone pointed this out to me on Twitter, and it was really smart. There's two ways you can view reality. You can view it as nothing is meaningful or everything is meaningful. Either the little things mean nothing or the little things mean everything. And I believe the little things mean everything. So thus, the condition of postmodernity is one that was imposed upon us by something greater than us and something metaphysical. You get to two interesting divided understandings of this. Either the more optimistic one or the more pessimistic one. But regardless, there is no denying, whether you think this is the Aeon of Horus or the Kali Yuga or whatever you want to call it, that we are in a state of extreme transition, flux, confusion, and things hitting against each other, right? And that creates condition for some sort of innovation, and that gets to the real problem with trying to eliminate innovation entirely, is that most religions, even those that claim innovation is not real, have some element of prophecy to them. So prophecy, what does prophecy have to do with anything? Prophecy is a thing that exists in most religions, right? That certain people have metaphysical visions that are sent to them by spirits or by gods that tell them something about the future or something that is going to happen ahead of the current time. Now, these prophecies are often apocalyptic. And what is apocalypse? Apocalypse is a Greek term that means revelation. It actually does not mean ending, and every religion hits an apocalypse at some point, some more extreme than others. And what's interesting is often the religions that claim to be the most stagnant and the most anti-innovation are the most apocalyptic religion. And after any apocalypse, innovation is necessary and stagnancy falls apart, right? For Judaism, they're waiting for the Messiah. For Islam, you're waiting for the Mahdi in the apocalypse. With Christianity, you're waiting for Jesus to come again. With pagan religions, you're waiting for various things, but there's always things in flux, right? There's always an end that we are going to hit. In Hinduism, you believe that these metaphysical ages are circling, and you're going to enter the next age and leave the Kali Yuga at some point in time. And when these ages flip, everything changes entirely, and that stagnancy can no longer exist. That stagnancy is replaced with something new, a new structure to the world. Thus, inevitably, every religion has some level of innovation going on. The only way to eradicate innovation is to believe that your religion is the end of time. Islam does this the best by saying that Muhammad is the final messenger, but is Muhammad the end? No, in fact, Muhammad throughout his entire life thought the apocalypse was going to happen at any minute. Thus, innovation is going to happen because inevitably something's going to hit the wall and something's going to change, right? So, what does this mean for us? If innovation is real, innovation is inevitable, what do we do? Because something's going to happen at some point in time. And I think that raises yet another question. Is there really a moral value to change never happening? Does that make a religion better, or might it in fact make a religion worse? Because inevitably, when something changes, when the next part of the cycle begins and we are all thrown through it, there'll be a radical shift. If the religion does not do something, doesn't that just create detachment? And it gets me to my hottest take of this entire podcast that I've been waiting to say until now. There is only one religion that is completely stagnant, and it is one that is so stagnant the premise fails, and that is Deism. I'm going to give this crown of the lack of innovation to Deism. So Deism is a religious philosophy that was popular right around the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was the time when really the lore was set for modernity, not post-modernity. This is when modernity began. The Enlightenment was a philosophical movement starting out of Europe that was really kicked off by the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, guillotine people. Wild time there in Europe. And then Europe had some other crazy stuff happen in the next couple times since then. A lot's changed since then. But this revolution was a one towards really the idea of progress, egalitarianism, secularism, individualism, all this stuff, right? Comes out of the Enlightenment. And out of the Enlightenment came a religious philosophy called Deism that is perhaps one of the most pessimistic religious philosophies you can even think of. Deism posits that we were created by a god, and then the god kind of just left us alone. This is not Gnosticism. Gnosticism can sometimes argue that our creator is evil. No, Deism argues the creator is neutral, but the creator has left reality behind. The creator basically set it up and then was like, yeah, my job's done here, and dipped. Now, that is a religious philosophy will never change because Deism implies that God will never come back and interfere with reality again. Whereas most religions have an interference going on, right? Most religions have prophets. Most religions have saints and mystics and special people who are able to talk to the gods. So let's get to Gnosis. Every religion leaves a possibility for Gnosis, for individual experience with the god or gods, right? Some religions encourage it more than others, and some gatekept who could do it. Still, some gatekeep who can do it, though I don't see a reason why you can't just do it regardless, but whatever. And Gnosis means you can continuously interact with the divine. And that, necessitates that things can change. Granted, it depends on why you're interacting with the divine. Are you interacting with the divine to just gain insight or gain closeness to the divine, or are you trying to make material change in the world? We know, right, as esoteric people, that all of those are possible through interaction with the divine, depending on what you are doing and why you're doing it for. This is the one time I will say intention might matter. So that puts another little hole in all of this. So, one last point. This is my final point. I'm serious. Maybe. And that is, can you believe in religion and believe in endless innovation and progress and all that? That is a complicated question, and one that I will give a mostly no answer to. There are certain religions that kind of don't have a metaphysical basis to them, where you can kind of adapt that to anything, and there are certain religions that have kind of come out of this idea, which is so funny. I think right now we're actually living through a very interesting time in terms of religion, because there's clearly a lot of questions. I feel in general that, especially here in the West, people have kind of been failed by Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity, and it's put us in a place of confusion and disorientation. And so people are converting religions at high rates, they're starting new religions, and in a sense, I believe a secular religion is emerging that is deeply spiritual in its points, yet does maintain a sort of veneer of secularity to it. So that's all going to be interesting to watch. And those, of course, those are the conditions of modernity. That is venerating the conditions of modernity. And, I think most religions need to be able to address this in some way. Like, why are we here? How did we get here? What does that imply for the rest of the religion? And what can we do about it? But there are certain things that whatever religion you are, you have to believe in, right? I think that your metaphysical backing and your paradigm is important, and I think we need to remember that the value and approval of the divine is far more important than the approval of the material world. Most ideas of sin or vice, and this was explained to me very eloquently on one of my other podcast episodes, I keep repeating it because it's just so brilliant. I believe it was Ars Philosophica who said this. most sin or vice is the rejection of the material, or most sin or vice is the rejection of the spiritual in favor of venerating the material, putting the world above the divine. And I think that is generally true. So, innovation. I think it's harder to avoid than you think, and I don't think it necessarily implies truth, but I think a truth must exist, right? I call myself a perennialist for a reason. I use the word perennialism specifically. A lot of people have turned perennialism into universalism. Perennialism is just saying everything is true. No, I don't believe everything is true. I believe there is an objective truth that underlies everything, that we have pieces of the puzzle too, and then by putting the pieces of the puzzle together, we will get the whole truth. I believe human minds are limited in our perception, and thus only with time and with searching will we get to the whole truth. That's what I'm trying to figure out, the whole truth. And where innovation fits in is a complicated question, because I think some innovation is inevitable. I don't think all innovation is bad, because I don't think you can avoid innovation. If you want to follow this to its farthest conclusion, you're going to realize that anything that's not animism is innovation. In a sense, the most anti-innovation movements are the ones that are based on some form of innovation. Often people just want to return to the innovation that they like, right? They just want to go back to the thing they liked. Like the Palmarians, I talked about them earlier. They're like, everything's fallen apart because change happened, but then they just want to return to the 1960s. That's not the beginning of innovation. That's insane. So, what do we need to fix the world and postmodernity? Is getting rid of innovation the key? No. Might hold a piece of the puzzle, though. And, maybe we should look at where are these things. I think tracing religions back have value. And I think that the further you trace religions back, actually, the more heretical you get, because we're so used to innovations that we think the things we believe are not innovative, right? Like me as an Episcopal thinking that was like the true Christianity. No, of course it's not. So send this to your most anti-innovation friend and play this video where you take a shot of caffeine or alcohol or something every time I say innovation and see how long it takes you to die. So heresy is good and heresy is inevitable. That's my other point. You're not going to get rid of it. I don't know how you can do that. People are, I don't know, religion's history is a history of iconoclasm. It's a history of people saying that their religion is the true religion and the oldest religion and the one that exists in the beginning of history, and trying to make that point by destroying what came before it. Even like Wiccans do this, right? Like I'm sure we've all seen some Wiccans say that like Gerald Gardner's Wicca was the first religion ever and everyone just covered it up and corrupted it. It's not. Wicca is not the first religion ever. That's like the most deranged take I've ever heard. But do Wiccans try to claim everything and like go full revisionist mode? Yeah, people do that. People like to look at the history and make the history what they want the history to be. Because often the true history is something we don't want to see. And that's why I don't claim full loyalty to any singular paradigm or religion, because I think the truth does not belong to any singular paradigm or religion, but the truth is out there. And that's what I'm going to try to figure out in my next solo episodes. If you guys have solved the question of what religion is true, put it in the comments. Let me know. What are your views on innovation? Just give me all your food for thought on this one, because this is kind of a reflection and a contemplation exercise in and of itself. All right, so like, comment, subscribe, and ring the bell, or give us a review if you're on a podcasting platform. If you want more podcasts, please join the podcast Patreon. You get all these episodes early. You get an extra episode every Neo-Pagan Sabbath. You get the pre-show, which is a little mini show that I do attach to every show, and all sorts of exciting things. And you also get your name read out if you're a high enough tier. So thank you so much to our lovely people who are under the name of, I'm pulling it up right now, Charlotte, Deacon, Lee, Smalter. Thank you so much for your continued contributions. I am Georgina Rose. I can be found on all social media platforms, on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Telegram, Substack, Threads, and YouTube. YouTube is my main thing. I post a YouTube video every other week and a podcast every week that's not that week. So there's an upload every single week to my YouTube channel. And all my YouTube videos are also available on Odyssey, because I like to back everything up in case YouTube dies or gets me banned. I don't think I'll ever get banned. I don't post anything that polarizing except for the heresy I post. But that's not against terms of service, so I think I'm good to go. All right, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye. All right, bye.